Good evening, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started with our webinar featuring Kelly Henderson, the founder of Formed Families Forward. We are also, for the first time, attempting to live stream on Facebook. So I hope that some of you are able to catch this on Facebook. Kelly Henderson is a special educator by profession. She is a former public school teacher of students with emotional and behavioral disorders. She's worked in national and federal special education policy and research settings. Her family is formed through public foster care and adoption. Her children have a range of learning, behavioral, and cognitive disabilities for which they have received early intervention, special education, and related services. Kelly has trained adoptive, foster, and kinship families and agency personnel on special education-related needs of children and has provided information and supports to many individual families. Kelly also serves as a part-time instructional faculty at George Mason University, training graduate students and special education teachers. Kelly believes that formed families must have information and advocacy tools to improve the delivery of appropriate services and to increase the academic, social, and behavioral outcomes for children and youth with special needs. Kelly is also an active participant in NewFound Families and our Family Support Collaborative. Checking to see if we are all live. It says a problem has occurred with the website, so it was reloaded. Kelly, are you able to hear me? Kelly, are you able to turn the mute off of your...
All right. Are you with?
Yeah.
There we go.
There we go. All right, Kelly, I have introduced you. We are live on Facebook, and we are recording this webinar for the use of future families through our YouTube channel. So if you would start sharing your screen and get started.
All right. I can see it. Can you see it?
I can see it.
Awesome. All right. So I'll just launch in if that's what you'd like. And as if I can't see the control panel as I do this, so you just pop in as things pop up that need attention, okay?
Will do.
All right, thank you. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for spending some time with us this evening, and thank you to Kate and to NewFound Families for inviting me to share a little bit about this mid-year muddle that sometimes comes to rear its ugly head in the doldrums of winter as we think about our kiddos who are perhaps having some challenges come mid-year with their schooling and their academic and behavioral success at school. So I'm going to go ahead and launch in. As Kate said, I direct Formed Families Forward. We are a community parent resource center funded in large part by federal U.S. Department of Education funds to support specifically foster and adoptive and kinship families in Northern Virginia who are, looks like we've got some folks on online, so welcome if you're just joining us. I'm Kelly Henderson. I direct an organization called Formed Families Forward, and we focus on the needs of foster, adoptive, and kinship families in Northern Virginia who are raising children with disabilities and other special needs. As Kate said in the introduction, I am a mom, first and foremost, of 3 boys, ages 14 to 19, and 2 of them joined our family through foster care adoption, and all of my kiddos have a range of special needs. I do serve as adjunct faculty at George Mason, and my daytime job is really shepherding families through great training and consultation and all the services that we offer at Formed Families Forward. If you happen to be a Northern Virginia family, I hope you know about us already, but if you don't, please check us out on our website at formedfamiliesforward.org. We have a number of great events coming up, including our Spring Forward Family Fun Day. It is our 5th annual event, and it will be April 7th. It is a Saturday, and the entire family is welcome. So very reasonable cost. We serve you lunch. You get some time for some professional and personal development while your kids are well cared for. And then we end the day with a really fun, busy craft activity fair staffed in part by George Mason University volunteers. So I'm going to launch into our content here. This idea that we are facing, for some of our families, a difficult time in the school year. Many of us have crossed the halfway point, and that first semester is done, and some of our kiddos are in new classes. And many of our children are that the newness of the school year has worn off, and some of the challenges are beginning to rear up, and it can be a really challenging time for some kids and families as we think about sort of how do we make it through this year and really focus on the best possible services and supports that the child might need to be successful. So I sort of divided this presentation into 4 sort of little phases. If you are struggling, what are some things that you can do? Well, first we need to know that there's a struggle, so that awareness phase, and then once we sort of recognize that we're in a bit of a pickle and we need some support, then we want to move into that early action phase. We want to try to, as proactively as possible, jump in and identify some paths to some support. And then beyond that, if those paths to that sort of immediate early intervention support is not doing the trick, then we need to move into something a little bit more definitive, and that may be assessment for disability, for the presence of a disability and the need for special education. And then we want to talk about intervention. We have a plan once we have that, if appropriate, the identified disability, and then we really need to have a plan. And even if you are a family that isn't, that for which a disability label is not going to be the path to follow, it's still really important to have a plan of action to address the communications and support that the school can provide with or without an IEP. So I'm going to move on here. So just very quickly, awareness phase is pretty straightforward. Many of us have lots of ways of knowing what's going on with our kids. Hopefully you found a way that works really well for your particular family. By this time, like I said, in the school year, you probably have received at least 2 quarterly reports, report cards, and interims perhaps in between those quarters. In fact, we might be moving in some school systems towards that first interim of the 3rd quarter at this point. So those are regular mandatory grade reports that should be coming to you by mail and probably also by electronic means. If your kiddo has an IEP, you should also be receiving at the same time you receive those mandatory grade reports, those regular quarterly grade reports that all kids are getting, you should be receiving an update on his or her IEP performance towards those IEP goals. Those should be provided at the same regularity as those grade reports to general education students. Other ways that you can sort of stay on track and be ready to pick up the first hints of a problem are those teacher-generated computerized grade updates. Sometimes they come to you by email. I know that some school systems actually use a text system where they're emailed to you on the spot as soon as a new grade is entered. Power School or Parent Portal. Some systems in our area up here in Northern Virginia use Blackboard. Both of those are online platforms that allow families and students to go in, see assignments, and most important for you, see grades, and the all-important missing assignments, or NTI, not turned in, one of my least favorite things to see on those reports. And that's really an opportunity for you to sort of jump in and say, what's going on? There's way too many missing grades, or grades that say not turned in, or grades that don't don't reflect the work that I think my child is doing. And then social media. A lot of teachers, individual teachers, and a lot of schools have Facebook accounts and even other types of social media, Twitter accounts, where you, if that's your mode of comfort, can actually sort of keep abreast at a very quick pace of what's going on. So those are just things to sort of stay on top of. I like this cartoon because it reminds us of the importance of really being preventive and really thinking ahead. So the mom is there ready to pick up her child, and the note on the teacher's door is, any child left more than 10 minutes past the last bell will be given a free kitten. So that teacher has figured out a way to prevent late pickups. So we
Kelly, we aren't hearing you.
Okay, sorry. Am I back on track?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. I think I was moving my bar and I hit something I didn't mean to move. So I apologize. Early action. I'm going to just take a moment to talk a little bit about Virginia tiered systems of support. Many of the folks here might not even recognize what I'm talking about. Hold on one second, let me back up. Because of the terminology does vary division or district to district. And I'm going to talk about some of the different words that are used, but this is a approach that is being used across the state, whether they're actually participating in Virginia tiered systems of support proper, or just using what we call multi-tiered system of support, or sometimes we call it response to intervention. It is an approach that's designed to improve instructional decision making and in many cases identify problems early on before a child really would require intensive services, and often that's done through progress monitoring, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I raise that here because you're going to often in school systems hear terms that speak to this idea of implementing some very immediate interventions that might be more than what the typical peers are getting or what the peers in your child's class are getting, but something a little different, but not to the extent where we're actually doing a formal evaluation request or a formal referral. So let me move into this quickly. This is just, you may have seen the triangle. The triangle has been used for about a decade now in different ways, often to describe academic and behavioral intensity of need. And so you might hear about tier 1 interventions or tier 2 interventions or tier 3 interventions, or unfortunately we sometimes hear about tier 1 kids and tier 2 kids, which is not the way we want to have this model termed. But that triangle, that green, yellow, and red, the idea is that at the very base level, at tier 1, that we are implementing school-wide interventions that are designed to address the reading, math, all the academic needs of the children in the school, as well as the behavioral and mental wellness, social emotional needs of children in that school. And then some kids, no more than 20% hopefully of kiddos in any one school, are going to need something a little bit more. They're not going to be responsive alone to tier 1 interventions, and so they might need a little bit more. And then a smaller percent, up to 5% of all kiddos, might need something even more intensive, more individualized. And so you'll see this pyramid, you'll hear it talked about, and I wanted to at least introduce the term. And then in these blue boxes are some of the language that you may hear that is related to these tiered systems of support. So you may hear Virginia tiered systems of support, VTSS. You may hear positive behavior interventions and supports, PBIS. And you may hear response to intervention, or sometimes called responsive instruction. And that's really more the academic component of this approach. Whoops. Let me move on. So very basically a definition of response to intervention there provided by the Virginia Department of Education. It really is an assessment and intervention framework used to identify difficulties before referral to special education. So really the idea of a system designed to be responsive to those early problems that a kiddo might be experiencing. Here's another way to look at that three-tiered model, or the triangle. I want to point out here that we're talking on the left side about academics, on the right side about behavioral systems, and actually the tiered systems of support approach is actually at a third sort of leg, which I could not find a good image of, for mental wellness. So a lot of school systems are really addressing all three systems, academic, behavioral, and mental wellness. And again, the idea being that we want to set up really good universal school-wide interventions and preventions that will work for all kids. And then we know that some kids may need a little bit more. If you are in a school that's using a sort of response to intervention or tiered systems of support, you may hear terms like universal screening, or you may hear a lot about kiddos in elementary school taking the PALS or the DIBBLES or the DRA. These are all just different acronyms for screening tools or progress monitoring tools and assessments that are used at the beginning of the school year and then periodically throughout the school year to determine whether there is academic delay going on, that the child is not picking up the content as quickly as desired. There are behavioral issues and possibly mental wellness. But these tools here in the green are really focused a lot on those academic needs. So you will, particularly in elementary school, have a lot of these periodic assessments or screenings. In addition, progress monitoring and universal schools, they're feature of multi-tiered really data-driven, just so we need to move into another phase, or little Johnny is not struggling at all, even though mom or dad says he's struggling. We don't believe he is. He's doing just fine. He just needs a little bit more time. We don't just make those on gut instinct or broad brush observations. We want to make those decisions based on data. And then finally, tiered instruction, that idea of the triangle again, of pushing in more intense interventions. I want to show you some examples from across the state of what that might look like, so that if you're in a school system or a school that is using some of these multi-tiered systems approaches, this is the kind of language you might see. This is just an example from a nice parent brochure I found in Augusta County off their website. And we're able to find things pretty quickly. So you can see they state very clearly that all students' progress will be reviewed 3 times a year using a universal screening assessment, and that will be in math, writing, and behavior. Reading, math, writing, and behavior. And then in some cases, there may be teams of professionals that will come around and address some of the existing data, take a look at the existing data, and where necessary, begin to think about which students may need some more intensive instruction. So that's the kind of language the kind of words you might hear. And these teams within the schools that are designed to sort of do this first brush of looking at what might be going on with a child who's not performing well on those screeners or those progress monitoring measures, those teams have different names, which makes it very confusing for a family to sort of figure out, who am I dealing with? Who do I need to go to? What is this meeting that is happening that's focused on the need of my children? And so sometimes those teams have names like instructional consultation teams, ISTs, instructional support teams, student service teams, student support teams, child study committees. It's a fairly common one that can have multiple functions, intervention assistance teams, and then sometimes we have teams that are called the Tiger Team or the Roaring uh, birds, whatever the cut over that school, those sometimes work there. And sometimes if a plan results from that meeting, that sort of first meeting, first level of meetings, those plans may have formal names, and they may just be something that was discussed at a meeting and it wasn't formalized, or even something that you necessarily as a parent will be seeing. Here's another example from another school system, from Albemarle. They use a team called the School-Based Intervention Team, or SBIT. And you see the definition there that really talks about addressing the issues related to student achievement, require more attention than informal networking that each school provides. It's a vehicle for teachers to identify problems in the regular classroom that appear to be interfering with the student's educational success. So you get the idea. So it's sort of a first stop. And in Arlington, up here in Northern Virginia, Intervention Assistance Teams, or IATs. Again, less formal, less regulation-driven process, but a group of professionals that meet to help problem solve about a child's early stage of challenges. I just put this in because I want to show how the process can sometimes be very confusing to a parent who's just beginning to try to figure it out. And this is this flowchart that was actually used in an article about Stafford, a number of elementaries in Stafford County. I don't know if this is still the model that they use. You can see there some of the years of data is some years past, but the article I was able to find this from is still available, so they may indeed be using them. But you could see the flow chart in terms of sort of the process of what school team would be doing, and where decisions are made, whether or not to go ahead and sort of pursue that educational evaluation. That's the next step into a more formal assessment process, and that educational evaluation there on the bottom right. So you go sort of moving on this flowchart from the upper left to the bottom right, following the different stages and progressions. So the lesson I hope you take away is that you really do need to know your own school system and your own school, and figure out what it is that's happening at that first stage, early intervention stage, where processes have been put into place, likely, that are designed to help identify when a child is beginning to go off the trajectory that we would want for typically developing children. So it's really important to know that people who can tell you that are certainly the administrator in your school. Your teachers probably know those terms. They may not be able to identify for you exactly that indeed that is related to a multi-tiered systems of support, or ITI, but they will know the name of the team that meets to address some of those concerns. And you can ask questions about, well, how often do they meet? How does a child become identified as needing the attention of the team? May I sit in on those team meetings? May I know the result of that team meeting? And you can begin to ask some questions. I'm going to move quickly on. Kate, I'm assuming you will stop me if questions are popping up in any box.
Yes, I will.
Okay, so I'm going to just sort of plow on ahead and move into sort of our next phase. So we're going to assume that that sort of first early intervention stage has occurred. Perhaps there's been some progress monitoring, some early intervention efforts have been made, and your kiddo is still struggling. Something is still not working academically, behaviorally, in the mental health or mental wellness world. Something is not clicking for your kiddo, or maybe more than one thing. And so the next phase is really sort of the middle step between that early intervention and being able to get the kind of intensive intervention that you think your child might need, is that assessment for disability. So I don't know, unfortunately, how many of you on the line right now are parenting a child with an individualized education program. If you can chat that into Kate, then she can give me a little bit of read on that as I progress through, because if most of you have already sort of gone into that phase and are living in that space, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time going through the process. So I'm going to launch into that, and Kate will just jump in when she has some information for me.
And I think, Kelly, since we are recording it, I think you should just barrel right
Move through? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you for that reminder. Why are we really worried about and why are we having this topic, I guess, of conversation as we think about our kids in foster, adoptive, and kinship families? So I just want to take a few seconds before we sort of jump into that process. We know that a lot of our kids who are in our families through foster care, adoption, and kinship are doing well, well-adjusted, and achieve very well. But we also know at the same time that many of our children, a higher than average, a higher than typical, or what we might say disproportionately high number and percent of our children do experience some challenges that to their development and to their academic performance that may or may not relate to earlier experiences that they have because of trauma, because of multiple placements, because of organic disabilities that may be in their makeup. It's really important to recognize that our kiddos may be at a greater risk of having significant special needs that require some type of specialized instruction. Generally, it's hard to get really great statistics, but nationwide, but generally we talk about a 3 to 4 or 3 even to 5 times the rate of identification of disabilities, presence of disabilities within our population. Here are some statistics that give that some meaning. I'm not going to belabor them, but know that it is not unusual. You are not alone if you are really beginning to say, I think there's something more going on with my kiddo, or I know there's something more going on with my kiddo, and I really do feel we need to begin to move into
We lost you again, Kelly.
help. I look like I'm on. You're not hearing me?
We're hearing you now. We had lost you for a minute.
Sorry, I'm getting a box that pops up every so often saying my internet connection is unstable. So one of many things that's probably unstable. I want to just go quickly through the provisions from a federal and state lens that help guide and protect our kiddos with special needs who may be informed families. First of all, we have a very strong set of special education laws and regulations, namely the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, and Section 504 and ADA, which are similar in vein. We have a good set of child welfare laws and regulations, including the Fostering Connections Act, and that is Kate's bailiwick, so she can always be a resource to you on that. And then there's a set of privacy and confidentiality laws that protect children information about children from being shared in public and from being kept in a file longer than it needs to be. So just know that there are ways that you can remove certain records from your child's file if you feel concerns about that. So we can talk about that in another venue, but just know that that Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act is really a strong piece of legislation that guides a lot of protections for your kiddo. Basically, Section 504 and the ADA are broad civil rights laws that protect rights if individuals with disabilities, I should say protect the rights of individuals with disabilities in programs and activities that receive federal financial assistance, including public school districts, and the ADA extends that to public accommodations, not just federally funded accommodations. And the idea, again, of the civil rights law is that it is protecting or prohibiting discrimination of those with disabilities. And that definition of with disabilities is very broad. It is any type of mental or physical impairment that, quote, substantially limits a major life function. And those major life functions are very broad: learning, communicating, reading, paying attention or focusing. Those are all different life functions that are clearly defined and protected under the law. For 504, we are talking about leveling the playing field. In short, we are talking about plans that allow accommodations to be made for your kiddo who has been determined to be eligible for Section 504, or a 504 plan, as we sometimes hear it talked about in the schools. And that really is things like extended time, perhaps, on a test, being able to have certain seating arrangements that are beneficial to that child. We're not talking about fundamental, significant changes to the way instruction is delivered, but we are talking about accommodating the needs of a child with a disability to give that opportunity to benefit from the learning environment. A committee does get involved in creating a plan for a child who's determined to be eligible for 504, and that plan has to be reviewed annually, but that plan does not look nearly as intensive or as detailed as an IEP, and we'll talk about IEPs in a moment. There are some procedural safeguards that do apply, depending on your school system and your school, who is responsible for making sure that annual meeting happens and responsible for making sure that the accommodations on the 504 plan are honored, varies. Sometimes it is a special education type person, a case manager of sorts, but it may also be a school counselor, or even a school social worker that may be tasked with that responsibility. Sometimes the classroom teacher ends up taking on a little bit of that, particularly in the elementary school. So just know that that sort of point person may vary. Amendments to the Americans with Disabilities Act actually were passed in 2008, and I just put this slide up here to share with you that those amendments did clarify a fairly significant broadening of the potential class of persons with disabilities. And this second bullet is one you might want to highlight if you're a family who is not yet or may never be needing the supports of special education. But this second bullet about academic success does not necessarily disqualify a student from being identified with a disability under ADA and 504. This is hugely important, and there is a frequently asked question link there from the U.S. Department of Education. This is something that if you have a child who is sort of at the surface, sticking their nose and mouth above the water to take some gasps of air, but still managing to sort of power through and get decent, maybe not great, but decent grades, or maybe even good grades because they're so capable, but are still struggling with maybe attention issues, focus issues, other special needs. This may be something you want to learn a little bit more about because it could help your child become eligible for some services and protections under 504. So I'm going to move on to the IDEA. Again, this is the special education law. This is where we did, and distinguished from 504 and ADA in that we are talking about children with educationally impacting disabilities that require a fundamental change in the instruction, in other words, specialized instruction and related services to be able to access the general curriculum and perform and achieve commensurate with their peers. I want to thank the Parent Education Advocacy Training Center, PETC, which is our statewide training and information center. I with their permission, stole a number of the slides that we're going to cover that talk a little bit about the cycle of special education, and you can find more information on their website. So briefly, special education, as I said, is specially designed instruction. It is provided at no cost to parents. At no time should a family ever be asked to pay for tutoring or pay for extra services, the assistance of an aide in a classroom, or materials, or assistive technology, anything like that, that is required and determined to be necessary to meet the needs of the child with a disability should be covered in full cost. Here are the legal foundations for special education. It is, as I said, the federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was first passed in 1975, called something else, but the same law has basically been reauthorized over the decades. Those that federal law and its federal regulations are then interpreted a bit and customized for a state and are found within the Virginia Department of Education there at that website, and they have a set of state special education regulations that if you have a child with an IEP, you really need to be familiar with, because there's a lot of good information in there that might not be shared with you otherwise. There are some parent resources there also on the Virginia Department of Education website. Here's the guarantee for our kiddos with who have been determined to be eligible for special education. They have a right to a free, appropriate public education that is known as a FAPE. We have a lot of acronyms in special education, and so FAPE is one of the really core concepts that is key to special education under IDEA. There's also a guarantee that children will be placed in the least restrictive environment, also sometimes referred to as the LRE. There is a protection of rights of the child and of their parents, including foster parents and or educationally responsible kinship providers. So all of you are sort of considered parents in most cases under the law for special education purposes. Parent participation in educational planning is not an option, it is a requirement under IDEA. Briefly, here's the cycle. We're going to go through it quickly, starting with referral. And that's what I said. If some of these other early intervention techniques have been tried and have not been successful, or a family feels that we really are raising a child who really has some intense needs and they really do need to have those needs examined carefully through reliable evaluation methods, and we really need to figure out what's going on with Johnny or Janie, then it is time to put the cycle into motion, and that's first step is a referral. This definition of what a referral is: a referral is a formal. It can be done orally. According to the law, you can actually state to an administrator at the school that you are requesting an evaluation because you believe your child is experiencing difficulties and believe that the child may have a disability that impacts their education. It is probably best practice to put it in writing, and most school systems have a formal form. It may be specific to special education, or it may be something called a multi-purpose evaluation request or referral, and you can find out what that is by simply going into your school's office or even going on their website. Some of the school systems actually have that available on their website, and you want to fill that out as completely as possible. Any additional information relevant to your belief that your child needs some additional supports and your belief that he or she may have a disability can be provided there. Once that written request is provided to the school, walk into the office and hand it and say, I am delivering this, and make a note of when you did it, what day you did that, and who you handed it to. That starts a timeline, and I did not include a whole set of slides on timelines, but know that there are strict timelines, again, set out in the Virginia special education regulations that every division across the state must abide by. So when you're referring, you definitely want to state your concern as specifically as possible. You want to describe any classroom and school-wide interventions that have been done, and to the extent you can, talk about the frequency and the duration and sort of the intensity of the problem, whether it's academic or behavioral, social, emotional, or all of the above. You want to put that information in. You're making a case to the screening team that indeed this is a situation that will require some additional evaluation and assessment. If early interventions have been put in through multi-tiered systems of support or a response to intervention, then this is the place in your referral to note that. Say, we have tried intervention A, we tried intervention B, and yet little Johnny is still not able to decode at the 4th grade level, and he's in 6th grade now. So you want to clarify anything that has been tried. So we're going to sort of move on ahead and assume that that referral is made and the screening team meets and they determine that indeed an evaluation is appropriate, that there's reason to believe that the child may have a disability, and then an evaluation is initiated. And again, there's timelines for all of this. But in essence, the federal law is very clear about what an evaluation should be. Not specific tests, but it does talk about the sort of principles under which the evaluation should occur. The evaluation is a process of collecting information about the student's learning needs through a series of tests, observations, talk with the students and family members and others. Again, no cost to the parents. You should not be asked to go take this form to your private occupational therapist or to your physician or to your neurologist or to your psychiatrist and have them do this evaluation and return it. That should never be asked by school. If you happen to have that information, that is information you may opt to share with the team when they come together to discuss the evaluation. I want you to note that last bullet, that parents are members of the team that review the evaluation data and decide what the next steps on that evaluation should be.
Kelly, could I stop you
Yes.
there for 1 second? If you can go back to that slide, I just want to make sure that you have a chance to address this from the perspective of the parents who are members of the team. We have foster parents on the call or on the webinar, and I want to make sure you have a chance to explain the foster parents' role.
Sure. And that's going to apply, I think, across the board a little bit, regardless if we're at the stage of evaluation or the stage of an IEP or the stage of an IEP review. So under Virginia's regulations, for special education, I want to clarify, for special education, there is a definition of parent. I don't think I necessarily put that in a slide here, but it is not difficult to find under that. You can go to the link for the regulations and just search parent and you will come up with the definition of parent. And parent is very clear. There's sort of a staged definition. So the first is the biological or adoptive parent. That's the first person who serves as parent under this educational decision-making role under IDEA. Now, as it applies to foster parents, that birth parent, if the birth parent's still active, there's not a TPR, there's no termination of parental rights, that birth parent retains those rights unless a court has said otherwise. So generally that birth parent has the opportunity and the right to act as the parent for special education purposes if they are able to do so, and the school system has a responsibility to find that person and deliver notices and let them know about meetings and expect them to attend. Excuse me. The next stage down, if that person is not engaging in that role, if the adoptive or birth parent is not engaging in that role, then a foster parent can and should serve as the educational decision maker in terms of IDEA requirements. Again, unless the court has said otherwise. So a court can designate someone else to serve. A court could designate a surrogate. It's not done particularly frequently in Virginia, but they do have an option of designating a surrogate parent to serve that educational decision maker role. But a foster parent can absolutely serve as that educational decision maker. And even if the birth parent is engaged and serving that parental role, a foster parent can attend that meeting. Again, that's often a negotiation that needs to occur within the team, but there is nothing forbidding or preventing a foster parent from participating in that meeting, even if the birth parent is serving as the primary educational decision maker, the designated person to give consent. Kate, is that sort of what you were hoping for me to clarify?
Yeah, I just know that there has been some confusion from time to time on the issue of the consent. And I think it's clear that foster parents can participate, But if there's a birth parent providing consent, then the foster parent does not provide consent, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. Of
And I
course,
did,
we talk about best practices, and the ideal would be certainly for a team of the folks that are closest to that child, the foster parent, the case worker, and the birth parent to sort of come together perhaps prior to a meeting and really talk about sort of what your goals are, so that there's a little bit of a united front and some uniform approach. That's a best practice. Certainly nothing in the law requires that, but families have found that to be helpful when possible. And I know.
And for those of you who are watching this live stream on Facebook, I have inserted the definition from the DOE regulations that Kelly was referencing.
Thanks, Kate. Okay, I'm going to move on, but stop me again if I can answer anything. So again, eligibility, then we've moved. Okay, so we're going to move quickly. We've done referral. We've moved into evaluation. The assessments have been done. There are some provisions about the assessment about culturally appropriate and native language and some of those issues. So just know that there's a lot of provisions about what that evaluation needs to look like. And now we move into eligibility phase, which is where now we have the data. And we're going to use that data as part of a team decision-making process to determine whether indeed the child is eligible to receive early intervention. That term early intervention is actually not the same way I was using it when we talked about VTF, the tier systems is for early intervention. In this case is really talking about our little babies and toddlers. They have a separate system called early intervention or infant toddler connection, you may know it as. So that's that term. But the question is this child eligible to receive special education and related services? And parents, again, depending on your role, you may be serving as parent, are members of the eligibility team and receive documentation of the determination of eligibility at no cost. This is a really important stage for families as you go through this process. It is really important for families, parents, whoever's acting as parent, to be an informed member of that eligibility team and not be receiving a whole stack of assessment documents the very minute that the team is going to be making the decision. You should ask for, if it is not provided, those results in advance. You should have an opportunity to ask questions and have clinical people explain the results of the assessment if it's not clear to you. And you should have time to sort of digest that and in some cases take that information to a professional that you may be working with outside of the school system. Many of our kiddos connect with many service systems and many see therapists and doctors and social workers and all kinds of folks outside of the school system. And so it's very reasonable to expect that a parent, foster parent, kinship caregiver, adoptive parent, would have time to deeply understand the information in those assessment documents and have time to sort of check them out with others that know the child before coming in and sitting in a team meeting to determine whether the child is indeed eligible for education.
We've lost you, Kelly. We can't hear you.
I apologize. I keep clicking the mute. It seems to dance around my screen. I apologize. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All right. Okay. I think I jumped ahead a little bit very quickly. Who is eligible? So we in this eligibility phase, and we now, as a team member, help the team based on the assessment data that has been collected and any other additional information you want to share. And that's particularly important with our formed families. We want to make sure that any additional information about past assessments, past experiences that would contribute to potentially contribute to an eligibility decision are part of the consideration of the team. So Unfortunately, we have a system that is still very label driven, which can be very off-putting, particularly at first. But know that these are the 13 categories under the federal law under which a child becomes eligible to be a child with a disabilities, using air quotes, so that they can receive the special education related services. So if you have a child who is receiving the support of an IEP, and specialized services, you probably know at least one of these categories has been used to identify your child. I want to point out just a couple when we're talking about our foster, adoptive, and kinship kiddos that are sometimes sort of the most common terms that we find used. Developmental delay, notice a little star there. Developmental delay is a term that is a broader term. It doesn't have to be quite as narrow, but it is only able to be used in Virginia for the young children, preschool children, really, until the year that they turn 6. So developmental delay may be something that you've had heard used with your child in the past, but likely is not being used once they get past that sort of kindergarten, first grade period. Other health impairment is a commonly used eligibility category for children with ADHD, certainly, and a number of other conditions. So some families have been fairly successful in applying other health impairment to reactive attachment issues, trauma impact, sensory issues. So other health impairment is a category that may be of value to look at as you're beginning to think about eligibility. The other one, obviously, is emotional disability that comes up fairly frequently with our families. Children who have diagnosed mental health conditions often can get services under emotional disability. That is not to say that there aren't other disabilities that apply with our kids, but those are some of the common ones that I hear a lot about amongst our families. So once that eligibility has happened, the determination is made that that child is indeed a child with a disability, then we move into that IEP phase of actually thinking about creating an individualized education program. And I want to point out the word program here because I do think it's an important distinction. Often folks say it's a plan, an IEP, an individualized education plan, and it really, the term program, I think, is particularly important. It is a program. It's not just a plan, but it is a program of services and supports that will be delivered to help that child meet the goals that are stated on that IEP. So an IEP is a written statement that describes the specially designed program developed to meet the needs of the individual child. Parents, again, foster parents, kinship caregivers, are to be members of the IEP team and participate with school personnel in the development of the IEP. Very important. IEP team decisions guide a lot of what should be happening with your kid in school. Federal law is very clear on what needs to be on the IEP. There are very, very clear expectations and requirements for what appears on the IEP, and it's not a short list, and IEP meetings tend not to be very short in time frame. So just know that these are things that you will see as you go to an IEP meeting and help create an IEP or review an IEP or do a revision to an IEP. Very important opportunity for families is that first one, the present level of academic achievement and functional performance. This is a place usually in the IEP that is has some narrative options. So if you have something that you really want the team to know and make sure is in the record, the present level of performance area, sometimes we call it the PLOP, present level of performance, is a good place to make sure that your concerns, your information is reflected. I won't read the rest to you, but you can see that there's a lot of statements and clarifications and planning information that's to be included in the IEP.
Don't leave that slide just yet, Kelly.
Sure.
Since you're not reading it, I want to make sure people have a chance to read it.
Absolutely.
On the recording.
Right, and I will say about the 5th bullet, the special education, again, this is that fundamental difference between a 504 plan, and IDA and the IEP, that we're really talking about special education. There's something fundamentally different about the instruction, the mode of delivery of an instruction that is being provided to a child with an IEP because of their disabilities.
Could you explain what is meant by participation with children without disabilities?
Sure. So that you'll recall that there were a couple of sort of foundational beliefs or principles that we talked about on the guide IDA, and one of those was least restrictive environment. And this is really how that becomes operationalized in the IEP. The team must state exactly how much time the child will be in settings with typically developing peers, or sometimes say general education environments, and those settings without access to general education or typically developing peers. In other words, resource room is a term that has been around a long time, but many of us are familiar with that idea of the special ed classroom, where there are only children with disabilities being served in that environment. So that would be a period of time where the child is not in an environment with non-disabled peers, and that needs to be justified because the strong preference in the law is that we want children to be in environments with their non-disabled peers to the greatest extent possible. We know that for some that's not the most appropriate setting, and it's certainly for some not the most appropriate setting all day long. So the IEP has to actually state percentages of time that the child will be in settings with typically developing peers and without.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, I'm going to move on. In addition to a statement of special education services, the IEP should include a list of related services for which the child needs to be able to meet the IEP goals. This is a full list or pretty comprehensive list. Some of them are not as common as others. Some of the most common related services that you might see on an IEP are speech and language services, occupational therapy, physical therapy. For kids with physical disabilities, you might have different assistive technology. You may have orientation mobility if it's a child with a visual impairment, those kinds of things. Some of the things that could benefit and have benefited children with disabilities from formed families are things like counseling and crisis intervention and social work services. Those are things that are available potentially under the regulations, but again, it is a team decision, and so that's another opportunity for parents and caregivers to leverage some discussion in that team meeting and say, well, I really think that because little Johnny has such great anxiety about math, maybe there's an opportunity for a small group work on anxiety, and maybe he could get that through your counseling department or your social workers, and really have that then written into the IEP. Any specialized services that require something that's sort of beyond the special education instruction, those can be identified as related services.
Kelly, we have a question. The question is, can you please identify what type of services might be considered occupational therapy in an IEP?
Sure. So I'm not an occupational therapist, and I don't want to mess this up too much, but generally occupational therapists are working on sensory issues and making sure that a kiddo is able to find strategies that are going to help him or her with some of the handwriting demands, like I said, other sensory issues that might come up. They're not working on gross motor necessarily, but tends to be like fine motor and attentional issues that may be related to a sensory challenge. So common services that an occupational therapist might do is working on handwriting. Like Handwriting Without Tears is a program that's used a lot in our area. And so the occupational therapist might be called in to really work on handwriting. In this day and age, there's a lot of movement more towards helping children use assistive technology to compensate for what might be very poor handwriting. So an occupational therapist might work in that arena as well of finding assistive technology. The other thing that occupational therapists really do a lot of, particularly the elementary and middle school, is that sensory integration and helping find strategies for the kiddos to sort of manage their sensory needs to move, to be able to find things. I'm thinking of a common tool that many occupational therapists use are strategies like putting the stretchy bands around the legs of a chair, of a student's chair, so that the child can sort of push their feet against that stretchy band during their time that they are supposed to be focused and working on an independent work task. So finding those sort of like hacks, I guess we might call them now, occupational therapists might do something like that. They also do a lot of consultation with teachers in helping them understand some of the sensory needs of their kiddos.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, I'm going to move on. Kate asked about the least restrictive environment. Just know that that is an important part of the IEP and an important part of the consideration the IEP team makes in terms of making sure that the child is indeed in the environment that's most inclusive of other typically developing kids. Once that IEP is devised, then we move into an instruction and monitoring phase where teachers and other related service personnel and sometimes paraprofessionals are assisting in implementing the IEP. Parents, like I mentioned, have to be kept up to date on the progress of their child at least as often as typically developing children are getting report cards. And then the cycle sort of starts back over again. That IEP is reviewed annually, and then periodically a review of whether that child continues to be a child with a disability is done. Used to call them triennial reviews. That is no longer required, that every 3 years a giant full evaluation is done, but some kind of revisiting by the team to make sure that that child is indeed a student with a disability needs to be done at least every 3 years. But definitely annually the IEP is reviewed, and then periodically a review of whether the child still qualifies for services under IDEA is made. A couple quick slides on transition planning, just because this is an area for many of our foreign families that becomes really challenging. There are some very, very specific requirements in IDEA about transition planning, and in Virginia, transition planning starts when the child turns 14, if not before. This slide says 16 because that's the federal law, but in Virginia, that must start at 14 or earlier. And it is really transition planning is a series of activities that can be done by the team with the idea that we know that transition into adulthood is sometimes rocky for our kids with disabilities, and we want to really prepare that child over time for the skills, expectations, functional skills, academic skills, behavioral, social skills that that child may need when they move into adulthood. And those skills services can really focus on education, can focus on training, employment, independent living skills as necessary. We really focus a lot in this age group on self-determination and encouraging a child to learn about their own learning needs, learn about their own interests and their strengths and their challenge areas, and take a role in determining where they want to head with their transition planning and preparation. And there's the official definition of what transition services are supposed to be, which is a little bit different than planning. So it's actually services that are designed to help that child acquire skills. And then, as I said, I jumped ahead a little bit earlier, every year, at least every 3 years, the evaluation a group of people need to come together and revisit whether that child continues to be eligible as a child with a disability. That may include taking new assessment data and new evaluation information, or it may be fairly cursory, depending on the nature of the disability. Quick slide about the protections under the law. IDA, as I mentioned earlier, has a very strong principle about parent participation and consent. You heard that term come up when we were talking about who serves as parent is an important part of that. Parents must provide consent for many school actions. And so it's important to understand those procedural safeguards, those rights, the due process rights as well under the law. And every family should get, when it's required that the school provide, a procedural safeguard notice at the initial request of services, and then periodically, usually annually at least, that procedural safeguard notice will be shared. Something that's very tedious to read, but provides a whole lot of information. When you're trying to fall asleep one night, pull out the copy of procedural safeguards, and that will be a surefire sleep aid, but it is important information to keep handy. If things are not going well, know that part of those procedural safeguards lay out a set of dispute resolution processes. So there are a number of options that are clearly stated in IDA. There are also some more sort of what we call informal mediation or informal options for dispute resolution that are not necessarily stated in IDA, and depending on your school division, some of those more informal or at least non-required options, and federally required or state required options may have different names. But in IDA, they talk about 4 main sort of options: mediation, due process complaint, a resolution meeting, and an impartial due process hearing. I'll go back briefly. Mediation is a voluntary process, so this would be when perhaps the family and the school are not seeing eye to eye on something. Both parties can request a mediation where an impartial mediator paid by the state is invited in to hopefully negotiate a legally binding agreement. Typically, it is encouraged that attorneys are not part of the mediation process, that it's an attempt to avoid the involvement of attorneys. But there are some provisions. If one party brings one, then the other party has to be able to bring one. The next stage, or another option, is the due process complaint, where a parent would actually file a complaint against the agency, or the agency could file a complaint against the parent, and usually that has to be related to a specific procedural violation, violation of one of the principles or foundations of IDA, such as identification of the disability, evaluation, placement, or provision of the free appropriate public education. And there are timelines for that. Once the due process complaint is filed, then the other party has opportunities to respond, and it can be pursued into a court situation. Other options within an IDA are the resolution meeting. So hopefully before a dispute due process complaint is actually filed, within 15 days, shortly after the dispute resolution is filed, then a resolution meeting could be scheduled to hopefully avoid actually going to a due process hearing. So sort of an intermediate step is that resolution meeting opportunity. But somebody has to file the due process complaint before a resolution meeting could get scheduled. But again, all of that could be avoided ideally with a mediation session. And then assuming that resolution meeting is not successful or does not occur, then because it can be waived, then an impartial due process hearing is the next step, and that again can be challenging because it does elevate the situation, but it is a right that families have under the law to pursue resolution to what they perceive as a violation. So, yes, Kate.
Yeah, sorry, Kelly. One of the questions that we typically get is from families about the IEP. When they don't agree with the decision being made in the IEP and they do not want to sign it because they do not agree with it, what happens? I mean, if they don't sign it, can the IEP continue without them? We get this question a lot about this particular issue, and I don't know if that means go directly into dispute resolution or if there's another step prior to that.
Yeah. So again, some divisions have these more informal steps. Sometimes it's called administrative review. And depending, again, you would need to sort of know your own here of finding out what those more informal. But filing a due process request or a request for mediation gets some attention. So sometimes that is an option that families can use if they feel that they've tried everything else. They can certainly elevate it, request that mediation, and then certainly file a due process hearing request, which would then prompt the resolution meeting option. But hopefully, there's a simpler answer to your question. And it really depends on the sort of the stage of the process. If there had been a standing IEP and the child had been receiving services and the family presumably was somewhat happy with those services, and the team comes together and says, well, we would like to change this, or we believe little Johnny needs less OT, or needs more time in a general education classroom, or less time in a general education classroom, or needs to have these goals addressed, and the parent does not agree with that. They do not have to provide consent. They can say, no, I do not consent, and you would not sign the IEP, or you could do a partial consent. That's also an option. You could actually write into the document what portion of the IEP you're providing consent for and what portion you're not providing consent for. Technically, if there is a standing IEP and you hold a meeting, you're not happy with the IEP that is occurring at that meeting, the team cannot come to consensus, and the parent says, I will not consent to this newer, most recent proposal, something called stay put kicks in, which is a provision under the procedural safeguards that basically says that previous IP stays in play, that they still have an obligation to meet the service commitment, and work towards the goals and deliver the level of services that were provided under that previous IEP. So it's not like the child will suddenly not have any services, which sometimes is intimated. I've heard in some situations that if you don't provide consent, then your child will no longer get any services. That really is generally not an accurate statement if that child has had an IEP before. So remember, there is a right to a FAPE, a free appropriate public education, and if a child has been determined to be a child with an IEP, then the school system has the obligation to deliver some special education services. Obviously, we want and hope that we can proactively avoid the conflict with that certainly comes to the point where you're having to talk about stay put and due process and mediation sessions. So if it's okay, Kate, I'm just going to launch into a couple of these sort of like thoughts about how to try to communicate effectively as possible. And then I can go back to that question if it's not resolved for the questioner.
I think you're probably going to resolve it here in this next few slides.
Okay, all right.
Great.
So these are just some like, again, not required by the law, but knowing that we are in an environment where we want our child to be successful, we need to work as a team. Many of us foster, adoptive, and kinship families have touched many systems and worked with many professionals. It sometimes can get a little cynical, dare I say it, that we really may lose patience with the process at times. And so it's just a couple slides here I wanted to share about sort of trying to keep it fresh and think about ways to get what you want and what you think your child needs without alienating the situation too much, and still being able to remember our foundational expectations that we want to be treated with respect, and the idea that we need to show that same courtesy to professionals who may be frustrating at times to work with. So I love this slide. I love Zitz. It's one of my favorites, a teenage boys. So, we want to make sure we're not just walking into a meeting and saying, GD, you are just wrong. We have the answers and you need to see it our way. So let's try to find some strategies that are going to be more effective. So one thing you want to consider, and we really, with our formed families, really encourage folks to think about this proactively before there's sort of an issue that comes up, is to think about what you want the school to know. And your child may be an important part of that decision. What do you want the school to know about your special circumstances, about the disability itself, about your home situation, about any past trauma, past experiences, triggering events, those kinds of things. And so I think there's no right answer to these questions, but I think it's important as a family, again, to the extent you can work with your child on this, is to really think about what do you want to share, and how do you want to share it, and who's going to do the sharing. And so again, documentation tends to be beneficial because you have some paper trail to that, whether that documentation is electronic, that you're keeping, an electronic file of, or hard copy. Really important to be very clear on what has been shared with the school, and help your child really be an advocate for themselves. And so we talk a lot about creating a 1-minute elevator speech. If you had 1 minute to sort of tell very harried school administrators and school teachers about what is most essential for them to know about working with your child, have that ready and make sure your child is able to give a version of that too that they're comfortable with. So these are just some statements that we use in talking with families about sort of how do you go about language with our special needs and special circumstances that our families bring. And I think it's really important to, certainly label disabilities or special needs, but also at the same time be very clear about what your comfort level is in that with that school person sharing that information with others. Including other students. So these are just some example phrases that you could use, or variations of this, in terms of sort of identifying the special need, disability, or otherwise any special circumstances regarding the family formation, and then sort of making a very clear statement about the level of comfort, the confidentiality that you want around that information. So once we get sort of past that, hi, this is me, these are our boundaries, this is what we are asking you to honor, those conversations with the school staff can be very productive and can sometimes be challenging as well. So thinking about the IEP team meetings, thinking about the eligibility meetings, thinking about problem-solving meetings for some of our kiddos with behaviors. We sometimes have meetings around what's called a behavior intervention plan, functional behavior assessment, so you may have been in those meetings. And I'm sure many of us have been in meetings with social service personnel and with private providers. And so, just some good reminders while we're in our calm place, for strategies to really be heard. These, the strong suggestion is to have an idea of what you really want to walk out of that meeting with. What do you want the result of this coming meeting to be? Is it an eligibility meeting? Well, then I want to walk out of there with a diagnosis, a diagnosis of ADHD recognized as an eligibility for other health services under other health impairment. I want to walk out of this meeting about behavior with a very clear plan for check-in, check-out, which is an intervention that we know works with our kiddo. I want to walk out of this meeting with a clear understanding that Mrs. Smith will not ask my son about his or her genetic history when we do this biology section. Whatever the case is, that you have a very clear understanding and expectation in your own head of what you want when you walk out of the meeting. If at all possible, bring another adult with you, whether it's a spouse or a partner or just a friend who may or may not have any idea about the special ed stuff, but it's just another body sort of on your side of the table physically and emotionally. If you don't understand anything at all, ask. There's no shame or embarrassment of asking about what you don't understand. One of my favorite phrases is So let me understand, or could you explain again? Or I'm hearing this and ask for clarification. There's nothing wrong with going back and making sure that you are completely clear on what's being said. And sometimes the answer changes from the first time statement was made and the second time the statement is made. So make sure you really understand exactly sort of where the conversation is landing. When you are ready to leave the meeting or end the conversation, make sure that there's some future step and you know who is going to be responsible for that next step with your kiddo. And records are obviously extremely important to make sure you're maintaining records. Again, that could be electronic. There's nothing wrong with just keeping it in an electronic file. Specifically on the IEP team, here are some strategies that have been tried and true. Build agreements where you can find those commonalities. Use and ask for facts or data or references. Again, the idea that we really want to make database decisions. And so when they say, Johnny needs to eat lunch in this special room with only children with needs that are like his. Say, okay, I hear what you're saying. Can you help me understand what you're seeing? What have there been incidents? I'd like to know about the incidents where he was struggling in the general education, the base school lunch. Help me understand that. How many times did this certain situation happen? Ask for information, ask for data, academic data as well. Always feel free to repeat or reflect on what you have heard. Let me make sure I understand this, or so I'm hearing this, and ask for clarification. If there's a little bit of tension, there's no, usually there's no harm in really sort of just being out there and stating it, saying, it seems, and you can use I statements, I feel like this is an issue that we don't have a lot of agreement around, or I feel like there's some question about this, or I feel like, Mrs. Jones has had a bad experience with Johnny in working on long division and seat work, and just sort of state it and see what kind of response you get. And obviously, with all, just as we try to do with our kiddos, try to acknowledge the positive and really appreciate the work that the professionals are doing with your kiddo, even if you don't necessarily agree with every single thing that they're saying, and as necessary, take a break. There is nothing wrong with saying, I just need a stretch break, or I need a few minutes to go get a drink of water. Can we reconvene? Allows everybody to sort of recenter themselves. The acronym. This was specific to. This is from the Harvard Family Education Project Harvard Family Research Project, and it focuses on parent-teacher conferences. I think a lot of the principles are valid for regardless of the type of interaction you're having with educators. Be heard. So best intentions assumed. We want to assume that everyone is there around the table working for best possible outcomes for your kiddo. Focus on learning. Really, emphasize what is it that we're working with our kiddo to learn, to master, to achieve. Homeschool collaboration. What can I do to help you at home? It would really help me if you were able to check the backpack before Johnny heads out the door and make sure that science textbook is in there. Examples and evidence, again, that idea of using data and informing our decisions with actual facts. Active listening, that's a practice that I know we really work with our kiddos, and it's a good practice to use with educators as well. Respect for all. Remember that we are all grown-ups and we're not going to achieve anything if we can't at least have a civil conversation that shows a core respect, and then that dedication to follow up, that who is going to be accountable for this next step, and with at point in time. Some sources, again, lots of links to the state resources, but at the top there are some national resources that are really, really helpful. Other disability resources, particularly as we think about getting our kids into longer services. And some great adoption, foster, and kinship care resources, including, of course, NewFound Families. There's our website if you need anything. We have a great online directory that has all kinds of, particularly regional resources, but a number across the state as well on foster, adoption, and kinship care. And I just want to encourage you, really use your experience. You are the expert on your own kiddo. It's really important in those days where it seems like you're ready to pull your hair out and that you're the only one on this one side of the table and everyone else is sort of against you. That you really are the champion for your kiddo. And so it's really important to try to use the strategies that you can to move the ball forward, and find ways to address those needs. And finally, just closing on some reminders of some of the things that really have been particularly helpful to other families. And I think I might have a poll. Do we have time for a poll?
Yes, I'm going to launch the poll as soon as you're ready. Are you ready?
Okay. Yep.
Okay.
So we were interested in knowing a little bit more about what works for you, and then hopefully having a little bit of time for a conversation, if there's an opportunity. Okay. So this is really, I think, this is really more of an evaluation of our of tonight's webinar, which is fine. So do this if you can. I was going to ask a little bit about what strategies you found successful, who have you worked with that has been successful and helpful to you. And so maybe you could chat that into the box and then Kate could feed that to us.
I actually have a poll for that as well.
Okay, so this poll may take a little bit longer. So I don't know, can you...
The attendees are now reviewing the questions. So if everyone would take a second and try to answer the questions in this poll, it would be great information to help Kelly as she continues to offer this tremendous service here in Virginia to families. Kelly, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to stop the recording while we're taking care of the poll.